It annoys me so much when prohibitionists try to tell me there is something wrong with cannabis. I have to practice calmness in the face of this idiocy. So you can imagine my frustration when reports began being published that some cannabis users were becoming weak and nauseous with abdominal pain and in need of hot showers because of their heavy cannabis use. But then, as someone who attracts cannabis patients like I do, I learned that there really seemed to be something going on because of an increasing number of cases being called Cannabis Hyperemesis Syndrome in the community, yet I remain skeptical and curious. Cannabis social media was apoplectic about CHS, and arguments about if it existed and if it was caused by neem or Eagle 20 or any other additive were really common. This week, lead author Dr. Ethan Russo has released the first original research on Cannabis Hyperemesis Syndrome, and they have discovered the genetic markers behind CHS. An understanding of what triggers the expression of those genetics is vital, and cannabis is clearly one of them. If you want to learn about cannabis health, business, and technique efficiently and with good cheer, I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. We'll send you new podcast episodes as they come out, delivered right to your inbox, along with commentary on a couple of the most important news items from the week and videos too. Don't rely on social media to let you know when a new episode is published. Sign up for the updates to make sure you don't miss an episode. Also, we're giving away very cool prizes to folks who are signed up to receive the newsletter. There's nothing else you need to do to win except receive that newsletter. So go to shapingfire.com to sign up for the newsletter this week and be entered into this month's and all future newsletter prize drawings. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and I'm your host, Shango Los. Today, my guest is Dr. Ethan Russo. Ethan Russo is a board-certified neurologist and former senior medical advisor to GW Pharmaceuticals. He served as study physician to GW Pharmaceuticals for 3 phase 3 clinical trials of Sativex. He has held faculty appointments in pharmaceutical sciences at the University of Montana, in medicine at the University of Washington, and as visiting professor at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He has been president of the International Cannabinoid Research Society and is former chairman of the International Association for Cannabinoid Medicines. In 1995, he pursued a 3-month sabbatical doing ethnobotanical research with indigenous people in Peru. Dr. Ethan Russo is author of several books of cannabis medicine and has published over 30 articles in neurology, pain management, cannabis, and ethnobotany. Dr. Russo has joined us before on Shaping Fire, episode 22 on treating traumatic brain injury with cannabis and mushrooms, and episodes 11 and 27 about his famous research papers on cannabinoids and terpenoids, and episode number 67 about treating migraines with mushrooms and cannabis. And of course, the Shaping Fire sessions on the Shaping Fire YouTube channel. Today, we offer Dr. Russo's first public interview on the results of his groundbreaking paper on Cannabis Hyperemesis Syndrome. Welcome back to Shaping Fire, Ethan.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start out by getting a little bit of context. While there's been a lot of social media discussion for what would become known as cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome in the last 3 years, the original index case that, way before it was named goes all the way back to 1996. How has interest in this syndrome increased over these 25 years or so?
Well, it has a great deal. There's been increasing recognition of it, so that diagnosis has become a little bit better, although it still remains the case that people that have it often have to go through many hospitalizations or ER visits before it's identified. It is increasingly common in relation to more potent material, meaning that cannabis being higher in THC. But overall, it still would have to be considered an uncommon condition, but one that is important to recognize.
That original case back in 1996, what about it made it stand out? I mean, that's some time ago. At the time, did they just say, "Oh, this person got really high, and therefore, we're going to tie this to THC," or was it not even originally tied to THC?
It was not. But basically, this is in Australia, and it was published along with about 8 other cases only in 2004. So it was only after a series of patients who were high cannabis users and were with close questioning that the pattern was identified and recognized.
So over these 25 years or so, what do you think was the main feature that caused the interest to increase? Was it just simply the increased use of cannabis, and therefore there were just statistically more cases of it, and so there was more ability to look at it? Or was there some change in scientific policy or a particular grant that broke the right way? Like what has increased the interest in it where people are actually looking at it now?
Well, it goes along with liberalization of cannabis laws in many jurisdictions, but most particularly with the increasing availability of high potency material, such as in vape pens and concentrates. So that's a factor, but again, there's the recognition factor. It all enters into the equation.
I see. Multiple things happening at the same time, making for this opportunity to look at it.
Sure.
Right on. So hyperemesis syndrome is described, mostly or at least up until now, as a basket of symptoms, a basket of these common symptoms. Would you describe them for us?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very stereotyped syndrome. So what it includes are cycles of severe nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain, but they're accompanied by a very characteristic finding, that is, of the patients who are afflicted with it engaging in hot showers and bathing, almost in a compulsive fashion, sometimes hours a day. And so that is really what we call the pathognomonic sign, the sign that clinches it when it's combined with the other symptoms.
So is it because, well, it's interesting that you would say hot showers. So we're not talking cold showers because they might have a fever or something. They want hot showers. Does the afflicted patient know why they want to take hot showers? I mean, what's their motivation? Why do they think they want to go take a hot shower?
Usually people are not aware of the condition and that this is an accoutrement of it. And they may just notice on a day when they're having abdominal pain and nausea that the time they're in the shower, they feel better temporarily. And so, humans notice patterns, and eventually they come to realize that this is making them feel better, and they pursue it, sometimes hours a day. And it's a frequent occurrence that the hot water runs out. And then eventually they end up in the emergency room with an extensive evaluation.
When you say that that the syndrome has got stereotyped syndrome, that sounds like the medical use of the term stereotype, because I didn't hear you describe any kind of like stoner stereotypes. What does stereotype symptoms mean?
It means in this instance that you see the same thing throughout. So if someone has this syndrome, they're going to have all these features: nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and the hot shower behavior or bathing behavior.
I see. In contrast, say, for example, if we were talking about lupus, where it's another basket of symptoms, but of the 30 symptoms, somebody might have their particular 4 or 5. So instead of a mix and match, pretty much everybody has most of these symptoms, or if not all of them.
That's exactly right. The vast majority of people are going to manifest all of these 4 features.
Has anybody died yet?
Yeah, unfortunately, there have been 2 clear cases on, this was not related to an overdose per se. Rather, they died of complications of the vomiting. If someone vomits repeatedly, eventually it's going to cause chemical imbalances, problems with the electrolytes, the minerals in the blood, and there have been 2 documented cases of deaths and question in a third, and there may have been others, but there have been 2 reported.
So let's look at the symptoms from a slightly different perspective. So as we've talked about them so far, we've been talking about these established stereotyped symptoms. and we're able to look at them in hindsight. Can you give us a first-person perspective of the patient and what they would experience? Like, what are the first ones to come on, and how can a patient delineate between these and, maybe like smoking while they have the flu or something? Like how do they know when they should be like thinking about this?
Right. Well, let's set up a sort of archetypal patient. This presents in phases. So, Cannabis Hyperemesis or Hyperemesis Syndrome is going to appear in someone who uses cannabis, and usually it's going to be a high volume user, most often of high potency material, meaning high in THC, and on a regular basis, most often daily or more than daily. But the phases are these. There's what's called a prodrome. This means an initial stage where, while people are using cannabis, they may develop nausea and vomiting, along with anxiety and some sweating behavior, the things that go along with stress. The second phase is clearer. This is going to have the hyperemesis along with the abdominal pain and the hot water bathing. And then the third is recovery, which happens only following abstinence. Basically, as long as someone continues to use cannabis, even in lower amounts, they're usually going to be at risk for having episodic attacks of a similar nature.
So when we're talking about the volume of THC that is required, and we'll talk about some of the other requirements or what we are seeing along with the THC, but specifically on the THC, you're saying like high amounts, and you're saying that, okay, so we're seeing more of this as flower is getting stronger, and we're doing concentration and high THC edibles. Does it matter? Let's see, how do I want to say this? Does it matter if somebody smokes a little low THC flower every day versus somebody who dabs on the weekends, right? Like maybe over the course of the week, they're going to get the same amount of THC, but in one time you're going to get it all at once, and then the other person, they're going to get a little bit every day. I'm trying to understand the nature of the threshold.
Yeah, well, that's going to vary with the individual, and unfortunately, once the syndrome has become established, the threshold is not very high. So, for example, if someone's been in remission after abstinence from cannabis for a while, we find that they often will resume pretty soon afterwards, not long, and it usually goes along with establishing again some degree of tolerance. So when somebody begins to escalate their dose to achieve their desired level of high, often they'll have a recurrence. So, to mention your example, this could occur in either context, the low volume user during the week or the dabber during the weekend, but I'm afraid there'd be no guarantees, and people can try to skirt the edges of this, but they're usually quite unsuccessful.
Sure. So, and I can imagine that, and we'll talk a lot more about the genetic makeup of these patients during the second set, but I would think that at the top of that list would be somebody who dabs every day, because these are the people in our community who are getting the highest amounts of THC every day.
Quite true.
So how about with edibles as well? We know that the mode of using THC matters a lot for a whole range of body responses. Are people who are taking high levels of THC from edibles having these experiences as well?
Well, they certainly may. In our survey, people had mixed methods of administration, but most prevalent were either smoking a flower or high potency inhalation by whatever method. Mm-hmm. That was the most frequent, but there's nothing to say that using an edible would prevent this, and in fact, it's going to be tough for someone who's in the midst of an episode of susceptibility to keep material down in an edible.
So, the fact that this research, it was done as a survey plus a genetic portion of it. It's interesting because it kind of shows two sides of the coin. On one side, you're asking people about their use, and then on the second side, you're actually running taking a short read of their genetics to find out what you can find in common. I can't help but have some amount of awareness that people don't usually want to talk about their cannabis use because of its historically being, prohibited and taboo. Would you explain how the survey functions? Because you and I have talked off mic about this before, and you've got a lot of good feels and a lot of confidence in the information that you're getting from these surveys, and I think we'd all like to understand how that works when the basis of the survey is asking questions.
Yes, sure. Well, first of all, this is all anonymized. If you ask me who was in it, I couldn't tell you except for a couple of people who have told me themselves after the fact. So great pains were taken to protect people's identities, especially in the instance of taking their genetic material. It's a highly formalized procedure of ensuring that that information can't escape. And this went, the other layer of protection was that this went through what's called an institutional review board, an ethics committee, to ensure that there'd be no danger to patients, and that includes being identified when they do not wish to be.
Is it hard to communicate this safety idea to people who are doing a study on something that may even be illegal where they live?
It sure has been in the past, a little bit less now with the liberalization of laws, but it remains an issue, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I like actually your use of the word liberalization of laws. I hadn't heard anybody use that before. A lot of people use legalization or normalization, but liberalization is yet a different way to put it, which is not the other two, which I don't think the other two really fit are what we're experiencing yet. So I like that. I think I'll use that myself. So, And did you reach out to these people because they were showing symptoms, and you reached out to them through healthcare providers, or did you just put a big call out to everybody and people who identified with the nausea and the hot showers, just kind of like self-identified?
Yeah, more the latter. It was systematized. I sent this to various listservs related to cannabis, to physicians who have an interest in cannabis. We also reached out to emergency departments and gastroenterologists, and we contacted people who had previously been authors of studies of CHS. It was put on social media as well. So there were a variety of methods of outreach. But people could only come to it if they self-identified as being interested in the study.
Right on. Okay, well, I want to go into the THC survey aspect and the genetics aspect in the same set so that we can talk about all of that at once. So let's go ahead and take our first short break and be right back. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is neurologist and cannabis researcher, Dr. Ethan Russo. Over the years, Shaping Fire has been invited to sponsor several cannabis cups, and I've said no to them all. It wasn't until the Autoflower Cup that I really wanted to help promote something, and the producers, Sebastian and Carla, didn't even invite me. I approached them. I told them that Autoflower Cup was important to me for 3 reasons. First, it was obvious that they were going for a friends and family vibe instead of some sort of commodified cannabis vibe. This event was going to gather really cool folks. Second, the event had a ton of cool stuff to do and to learn and to participate in. The event isn't just about cannabis. It's about living life fully, enjoying community, eating together, laughing and listening to music, and mushrooms. Third, and most important to me personally, the event was authentically for the Autoflower community, and the Autoflower community needs a place too. Autoflower is about getting high, sure, but I find that much of the Autoflower community is still focused on cannabis patients, home grow, sharing best practices, sharing seeds, and humility. These are the ideals that I share with the event, and I wanted to make sure I did my part to help it succeed. Announcing the 2021 Autoflower Cup, August 6th, 7th, and 8th in Lillooet, Washington, just outside of Seattle. This over 21 event is presented by Camp Ruderalis. The Autoflower competition is open to everyone, commercial and home growers, so get your skills recognized and enter today. A cup win now will make you a leader in the community. Here comes the ear candy. Stunden Glass Hookah Lounge, pop-up magical butter chocolate shop, waterfront marketplace with an array of vendors. There will be an old school autoflower seed swap, joint rolling competition, cannabis cooking demos, solventless squishing demos, and late night documentary screenings of fantastic fungi. Chef Sebastian Carosi's award-winning classics like elk chili, Kobe beef kimchi dogs, oyster po' boys, and razor clam chowder. Wild oyster harvesting, mushroom foraging, s'mores around the campfires each night. Dan Jimmy of Mandalorian presentations, psilocybin mushrooms presentations, camping, glamping, RVs, and Airbnb. So check out CampRuderalis.com for those details and follow the Instagram at the Autoflower Cup 2021. Sometimes the topics I want to share with you are far too brief for an entire Shaping Fire episode. In those instances, I post them to Instagram. I invite you to follow my 2 Instagram profiles and participate online. The Shaping Fire Instagram has follow-up posts to Shaping Fire episodes, growing and processing best practices, product trials, and, of course, gorgeous flower photos. The Shango Los Instagram follows my travels on cannabis garden tours, my successes and failures in my own garden, insights and best practices from personal grows everywhere, and always gorgeous flower photos. On both profiles, the emphasis is on sharing what I've learned in a way that you can replicate it in your own garden, your own hash lab, or for your own cannabinopathic health. So I encourage you to follow at Shaping Fire and at Shango Los and join our online community on Instagram. With the National Hemp Program in flux due to stringent THC testing requirements, brothers Seth and Eric Crawford continue to release seeds to hemp farmers that will be legal, no matter how you grow them or when you test them. These new varieties from Oregon CBD Seeds have substantial amounts of CBDV, CBGV, CBCV, and THCV, while always staying below the 0.3% THC limit and guaranteeing compliant crops for farmers every time. Also, these new varieties cannot be pollinated by your neighbor's uncontrolled pollen or a rogue male in your own crop either. Oregon CBD Seeds are non-GMO certified too. Oregon CBD Seeds was founded and funded in 2015 by Seth and Eric, maxing out their personal credit cards without outside investment. They continue to refuse outside investment that would change their company culture. Oregon CBD grows tons of fresh food on their research farms for local food banks, literally tons of food. They also give away tens of thousands of pounds of R&D flower to patients. As their company began to succeed, Seth and Eric started donating money to the cannabis medicine and hemp fiber cause too, by giving millions of dollars to Oregon State University in order to establish the world's leading cannabis genomics research program. And they treat their employees right. Oregon CBD pays for full health and dental coverage for their employees, a 401k program, and their minimum starting wage is $20 an hour. Plus, everyone shares food from the farms. Seth has been on Shaping Fire a few times to talk about novel cannabinoids. You can check out episodes 25 and 37 on CBD cultivars in the hemp market, episode 66 on triploid cannabis genetics, and the very first Shaping Fire Live, episode 47, with Seth and soil expert Jeff Lowenfels talking about autoflowers. If you are a hemp farmer and you want to grow reliable seeds that are sure to thrive in past testing, check out OregonCBDSeeds.com to learn more about buying seeds for the 2021 season. That's OregonCBDSeeds.com. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I'm your host, Shango Los, and our guest this week is neurologist and cannabis researcher, Dr. Ethan Russo. So let's dive into the first half of this paper, which is about the survey, about talking to cannabis users about their usage of cannabis generally, but more specifically, you're trying to tease out THC. How did you go about asking the questions, Ethan? What were you trying to pull out of them? And after they answered, what did you see in the results?
Sure. Well, it was a large series of questions, as you've seen, and will be evident in the paper because we include links to the entire survey, both the CHS patients and the controls. So we went through simply saying, have you used cannabis in the last year? How often? How much a day? What type? By what method? Et cetera, until we got the answers we wanted. But we started out with 585 respondents. Of that, there were 205 patients who had the constellation of symptoms of cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome and carried a diagnosis. So we were being very careful about who we selected for the study. We needed medical confirmation plus ongoing symptoms. So that's how you get from 585 to 205. Of that group, most were very high frequency users of cannabis. 91% used daily or multiple times a day. And as we mentioned, it was a high amount. Cannabis flower or concentrates, the median response was 4 grams a day of
Wow.
THC predominant material. Other features of the CHS patients, 15.6% carried a diagnosis of either cannabis dependency or addiction. So that's much higher than you'd expect in other populations. And to corroborate that, almost 57% had experienced withdrawal symptoms from cannabis, which was also uncharacteristic. Now, on the good side, when people stopped, like they might have gone to the emergency room and told they had to stop using cannabis, 87.7% improved after they stopped, but almost all suffered a recurrence when they resumed. Now, a big problem in this study was finding out who do we compare these people to. We couldn't just use normal people who didn't use cannabis because we wouldn't know if they had a susceptibility to developing cannabis hyperemesis syndrome if they hadn't used it in similar amounts. So we found controls, so-called, who were high volume users of cannabis but did not have CHS. So we ended up with 54 of those. And in the survey information, all of them had used within a year. 70% were daily or more than daily, and again, mostly by smoking THC predominant material. Now, in contrast to the CHS patients, only 3.7% had been labeled as cannabis addicted or dependent, and the vast majority, 76%, had never had withdrawal symptoms. Only 11% had been told that they needed to stop cannabis for health reasons. So we felt that this was a good comparison group. And so these two pools, the 205 patients with CHS that was confirmed, they had all the symptoms, they had ongoing symptoms, they had a diagnosis from a physician, and 54 controls. All of these people were offered the option of having their genomes tested. This is done by a swab in the mouth, and through the technology, that sample is amplified so that we can look at all the base pairs of the genetic sequence and see if there are any unusual patterns. So that's how it was done. Now that really whittled things down. Although 99 patients from the CHS group agreed to get a test kit, only 28% returned it.
That seems especially low.
Here.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, especially after they said they were willing to do it. But we actually had a little bit of pushback from the CHS community. There were people that questioned our motives. There were some people that said you shouldn't do this study. So it was very difficult. It took us a year of recruitment to get our sample, which ended up being 28 CHS patients and 12 controls.
Were people pushing back because it was being sponsored by a private company instead of an academic institution?
Well, it could have been a factor. But let's make something clear, and I don't know how to say this except telling the truth. It's going to sound accusatory. But people with CHS tend to be very suspicious. And many people who have it don't believe that it's related to their cannabis usage. I mean, after all, everyone knows that cannabis is supposed to be good for nausea and vomiting. So how could it be creating this problem? Well, in fact, THC is an antiemetic, something that helps prevent vomiting, but it's also subject to what's called a biphasic dose response. What that means is, at low doses, THC will prevent nausea and vomiting to some degree, hopefully a lot. But at high doses, it flips its activity and can be pro-emetic, meaning making vomiting more likely. Plus, there are other considerations. When someone uses cannabis to this extent, they have tolerance. Part of tolerance is that the CB1 receptors in the brain where THC works downregulate. They sort of fold in. It's the brain's way of saying too much activity here, we've got to turn down the volume. So there are all these things that may be coming into play, as well as the metabolism, the breakdown of THC that we had to consider. As we discuss the results, this will become more clear.
So so you sent out these 99 kits, and about ended up being about 25% of people responded. Did you see enough in the data where you were able to get what you wanted, even though you got less participation?
We believe so. I mean, the proof of something medical is in the statistics. So what we want to see to make something statistically significant is what's called a p-value, probability value of 5% or less. What that means is that the results that are seen could only happen by chance 1 in 20 times or less. And so we achieved that with several examples. Obviously, it would have been better to have more patients, but that, again, proved very difficult. It wasn't just the pushback from the community. There are a lot of people who don't want their chromosomes tested. They've heard of situations of people getting arrested not because they had their genetic profile done, but their cousin did, and somehow law enforcement found their way to the person in question. There have been some high-profile cases solved recently related to this technology.
All right. Well, I can see that. So as far as a patient having hyperemesis syndrome, it seems like after reading the paper, we're talking about two things that have to both happen. Number one, the cannabis user needs to have a high overall use of THC, which appears to be predominant daily, and that they're using more than 4 grams of high THC material a day. And of course, while that's a big swing between 4 grams of flower versus 4 grams of oil, one way or another, you're at a high level as far as the overall users in the United States. 4 grams of flower a day, while not necessarily incredibly high for a lot of people I know, if we take the pool of all cannabis users, it's actually exceptionally high.
It is, and I would emphasize that lower levels of use could also lead to problems in someone who's susceptible.
Right on.
But this will vary.
All right, then let's get to that susceptibility part. So the first part is you take you know, more or less you take in a lot of THC, but that has to be coordinated with someone's genetic predisposition. And so this part of the paper, unraveling the genetic makeup, I can admit to the fact that it's a bit over my head, but luckily you break it down to, there's pretty much 5 places that popped up for you that showed that some correlation. Would you go through as you see fit the 5 sites and what you learned from those sites?
Sure, be happy to. But let's start off with one that we suspected that didn't turn out to have a pattern, at least in the patients that we examined. So that would be a gene called CNR1. That's the gene that encodes the CB1 receptor. So CB1 is where THC works and the endogenous cannabinoids work. This has been examined before in relation to other disorders. And what we're looking for is often what are called single nucleotide polymorphisms. This is a way of saying that there is a change in one pair of these base pairs in DNA. So there's been some correlation of mutations on CNR1, the CB1 receptor gene, related to cannabis usage, but we didn't see that pattern in the cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome patients. But there's a disorder that's sometimes confused with CHS called CVS. That's cyclic vomiting syndrome. Now this is actually different. This is often something that appears in childhood, but may persist into adulthood, and people have episodes of vomiting that come out of the blue. It seems to be related to a propensity for migraine. So sometimes this starts off with a child who has episodic vomiting without a headache, and it's only when they're older that they get the headaches. Now, CVS, cyclic vomiting syndrome, has become more confused with CHS because in CVS, people use cannabis to advantage to treat the nausea and vomiting. But in cyclic vomiting syndrome, there have been mutations in the CNR1 gene that have been observed. So this is another point of distinction. So I wanted to start there where we expected a finding, but it wasn't there. But it still is useful because we can differentiate this from cyclic vomiting syndrome.
Got it. It creates a nice point of contrast.
Sure. Now, what did we find? Well, we'll start off with a gene called COMT. That is short for a mouthful, catechol-O-methyl-transferase. COMT is the gene that codes for an enzyme that breaks down catecholamines, especially dopamine. So these are neurotransmitters in the brain and elsewhere. So what we saw was a mutation in the COMT, and this occurred in 57.1 of the CHS patients, but only 10% of controls. So that had what's called a p-value of 0.012. So that's well below the 0.05 threshold that makes something statistically significant from a medical standpoint. And it had what's called an odds ratio of 12, which is quite wide as compared to the controls. So what do we know about this mutation? Well, when COMT has a loss of function, you have too much dopamine, and an excess of that is associated with a number of different problems like compulsive behavior, and that can be anything from substance abuse, gambling, even sex addiction have been related to this. This specific mutation that we saw is called RS46346316. I'm sorry, let me do that again. RS4646316. In prior studies, this has been related to depression, what's called rumination behavior, where people can't get something out of their head, they ruminate about it, and also heavy alcohol intake at a younger age. And that is a feature in our survey that we saw in CHS patients, that a lot of them had problems with alcohol at one point in their life or not. Other mutations on this gene have been associated with impulsive behavior, disinhibited behavior, also some associations with attention deficit, obsessive compulsive disorder, and I'm afraid a tendency towards anxiety and even psychosis. So it doesn't mean that somebody who has CHS has all these things, but we have seen similar problems in this population. It means that they're more likely to have these kinds of problems. But certainly this finding provides some insight into some of the things, the epiphenomena, the features that we see in CHS patients.
All right. So is that complete on the COMT? Is everything that? Do you want to move on to the next one?
Sure.
All right.
Sure.
Let's do that.
Well, the next one is one that I predicted. One of the features of CHS is one of the things that seems to help, of course, is the heat. Also, use of capsaicin ointment on the skin. Capsaicin is the caustic part of chili peppers. Some time ago, it was noticed that when people had application of an ointment with a lot of capsaicin in it, that it would reduce the nausea and vomiting, at least temporarily. So what the hot showers and the capsaicin have in common is that they're working through another receptor called the TRPV1 receptor. And we saw a mutation there, and that was something we predicted. So 71.5% of the CHS patients had this, and only 30% in controls. So that's a p-value of 0.015, below the 0.05 threshold, and an odds ratio of 5.8. So this gene has been linked to anxiety and pain responses in the brain, and it's also has activity on areas of the brain that relate to how fast or slow your gut is moving, on how much fluid is secreted. So it has a definite tie-in to nausea mechanisms. Now, as far as we know, so far, the TRPV1 mutations haven't been observed previously when we've looked at patients with cannabis dependency. Now, our finding on this specific mutation may be a new one, because it wasn't in the usual databases of genetic changes. So this one is called RS879207. But certainly the findings that we got suggest a linkage of cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome to mood and gut disturbances, as well as obviously the hot water bathing behavior. And it again goes along with the success of using capsaicin on the skin. That TRPV1 receptor is really important in this disorder.
Is capsaicin a common input into topical lotions? I haven't personally come across it before, though it could be very common. When I heard that people were using that and they're like, oh, this works for me, I'm like, I would never have even tried that.
Sure. Well, it's funny because it burns when you put it on. It's like chili peppers. I should point out, though, that absorption of capsaicin orally is not very good. People have eaten Thai food that was too hot. Sometimes it'll burn on the way in and on the way out. It's not getting into the bloodstream, but it does get into the bloodstream through the skin, as opposed to cannabinoids. So we know that you can get blood levels this way. Interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Is there anything else that you want to mention on this particular site?
No, I think that's good for now. We actually saw mutations in another area of the same gene, but it didn't quite reach statistical significance.
Is it the kind of thing where you highlighted it and it's worthwhile to look later on, or is it like,
bet.
Oh yeah, do you want to tell us a little bit about it, even though for this study it's not statistically significant?
Sure. It's something we're going to keep in the back of our minds as we get more people tested. Maybe it will achieve statistical significance at some point. And certainly if a person ends up having a mutation on two areas of the same gene, it increases the likelihood that it isn't going to work properly and that there'll be attendant problems. In other words, disease manifestations.
Right on. So what is this other site?
Oh, it's just a different area of the same gene.
I see. So you just saw the correlation number was high, but you didn't take it that next level to figure out what it might be doing there yet because the numbers were too low.
Right. So
I understand.
It's something to keep an eye on in the future.
All right. Well, then what's our next site?
Next one also makes some good sense. This is the CYP2C9 gene. So this is a gene that it's in the cytochrome P450 series. These are enzymes that break down drugs and toxins in the liver. Okay. Mm-hmm. As it turns out, CYP2C9 is the breakdown enzyme for THC and its first metabolite, 11-hydroxy-THC. So if there's a problem with this gene, it may mean that THC doesn't get broken down as readily. So we saw a mutation in the CHS patients in 46.4% and only 10% of controls. So the p-value wasn't quite as dramatic, but it was still 0.043, which is below 0.05. So, if we think about this conceptually, if this enzyme is not as functional as it should be, it could lead to accumulation of THC and get into that biphasic dose response where THC, instead of becoming antiemetic, becomes pro-emetic. Or it's even possible, because the enzyme isn't quite right, that it's making a different metabolite than usual. Instead of 11-hydroxy-THC, it's possible, probably unlikely, but it's possible that it's making a different product that could have toxic effects. Now, to help us out here, just a couple of months ago, there was a new study where a single patient got tested, and they had two sites on CYP2C19 that were off. That was a CHS patient who was cannabis dependent, and they said had a personality disorder as well. They didn't provide a lot of detail on that. So this is something that's been seen at least one other time. But our study was the first to look at it systematically.
The idea that this CYP2C19 is where THC gets broken down, am I thinking about this correctly? If I were to think of it as, okay, normally when we use THC, it is cleared from our body in 3 to 4 hours, or at least from the usable flow in 3 to 4 hours. And so with this site not working effectively, it would just simply either A, break down the THC in longer than 3 or 4 hours, so there's almost like a half-life, because you'd already be smoking your next smoke before all the prior THC is processed, or maybe it's the THC is being broken down incorrectly, not towards like body best practices, if you will, and so it's actually kicking out chemicals that are not what you expect when you smoke THC.
Yeah, that's right. You had said CYP2C19. This is actually CYP2C9.
Oh, okay.
But I'm glad you mentioned that because CYP2C19 also breaks down THC. It's just not the predominant enzyme that does.
Okay.
And we did see changes there in a few patients, but again, not with statistical significance.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So by my count, we have hit either 3 or 4 sites. So we've either got 1 or 2 left. What's our next one?
Yeah, we've done 3.
Right.
Well, we've talked about 4, but 3 that were statistically significant. Now, the next one relates to the first one, and this is DRD2. This is the gene that codes for the D2 dopamine receptor. Again, dopamine is a chemical messenger neurotransmitter in the brain. And DRD2 is the target of most antipsychotic drugs used to treat schizophrenia. And when there's a drug that stimulates this receptor, it actually causes vomiting and affects the gut motility, how fast the gut is moving. So we saw mutation in DRD2 in 60.7 of the CHS patients and only 20% of controls. So the p-value on that was 0.031, well below 0.05. This same mutation, which is on a thing called RS4648318, in prior studies is strongly associated with depression and anxiety. Those are features we see a lot in CHS patients, unfortunately. Also, there have been associations of other mutations on this gene with nicotine addiction, Tourette syndrome, and chronic pain. And those are all, addiction and chronic pain were features that we saw in a number of the respondents. Now, I should point out that we have a mutation on DRD2, also on COMT, the gene that breaks down dopamine. So we've got sort of a double whammy here, so to speak, affecting dopamine metabolism. And this may really help explain how cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome is associated with nausea and vomiting and some of these psychiatric problems that seem to appear in the same patients.
All right. So it's interesting to see that this is the second site that we've talked about that's directly related to the dopamine system. And so no doubt that's playing a significant role in the syndrome.
Yeah, and it also points out something else we know phenomenologically, and that is that the drug haloperidol, which is normally used to treat schizophrenia, is more effective in treating the nausea and vomiting in CHS patients than the more commonly used drugs. More commonly used are things like ondansetron, and granisetron that work through a different receptor. They work very poorly in CHS patients. Now, the problem is that haloperidol is a drug you don't want to be taking all the time. It has a lot of side effects. It's extremely sedating, can be associated with massive weight gain, and some really terrible long-term side effects. Possibility of developing diabetes or a movement disorder from the drug called tardive dyskinesia, which is extremely difficult to treat. So taking haloperidol on a regular basis isn't something that people are going to want to do. We have to look at better approaches.
All right. I've got two quick comments on vocabulary. First of all, I don't know much about the drug Dancitron, but I love the name Dancitron. It sounds like a video game.
On Dancitron.
Oh, all right. Well, that's still pretty good. It's got a playful ring to it still. But more importantly, for a moment ago, I was searching for the word syndrome, right? And I kept on wanting to come up with disease. When used, as a medical term, what does this word syndrome mean?
So a syndrome is a pattern of problems that leads to a diagnosis. A disease is due to one cause, whereas a syndrome may have multiple different causes. Okay? Mm-hmm. So actually we'll use a misnomer. We talk about Parkinson's disease. It's not really a disease because there's more than one cause. It should be called Parkinson's syndrome because when you lose a certain number of neurons related to the dopamine system again in the brain, that can come from any cause. Aging, strokes, toxins. When you have killed off 90% of those cells, you have a Parkinson's syndrome. So a disease would be more like strep throat, a disorder caused by streptococcus. But unfortunately, these terms are used somewhat interchangeably, and But a syndrome is a pattern of symptoms or signs that leads to a diagnosis.
Okay, thanks for doing that. So what's the fifth and final site we're going to talk about here?
Yeah, well, this one is a little harder to explain. This is on something called ABCA1. That's the ATP binding cassette transporter. This gene affects cholesterol and other lipid metabolism. It's most important in that it's related to Alzheimer's disease. And in that disorder, there's an accumulation of abnormal proteins in the brain. And we'll get to how that relates here if we can. So we saw a mutation in ABCA1. That was present in 67.9% of the cannabinoid hyperemesis patients and only 20% of controls. So that was a p-value of 0.012, well below the 0.05 threshold. Now, additionally, this was a homozygous mutation, meaning that, we have two sets of each chromosome, and it appeared in both. It wasn't just on one, it was on both. So, unfortunately, because this gene mutation appeared in both chromosomes in affected patients, it could imply an increased risk of the development of dementia, memory loss later in life. And additionally, it could lead to risk factors for coronary artery disease, heart attacks, and the development of type 2 diabetes. Not this specific mutation, but another mutation on a closely related gene, ABCB1, were associated with cannabis dependency in another study. But we certainly see a higher degree of cannabis dependency in the CHS patients than we could explain by chance.
So when you got the results and you saw these 5 sites, there was a lot of correlation, and then there was the other one that didn't have quite enough significant correlation. Was your initial response like, hot damn, there's 5 sites, we have something here? Or were you like, oh, we were really hoping for 10, this isn't a lot? Or like anything more than 1? As somebody who is, I don't do your job, so I don't know whether or not getting 5 hits like this is like wildly successful or regular or low.
I was excited. Good. I think we really have something here. We have several genes that help explain the phenomenology of CHS. Now, I should emphasize, I don't know that any of the patients had all 5 mutations, but often they'd have combinations of one or several. And what we're looking at again is a susceptibility factor. We hope that we can use this as a screening device. As it is now, someone who has this constellation of symptoms ends up with a lot of hospitalizations and emergency department visits. And that is very invasive and expensive. There have been 2 quotes in the literature of how much people have spent before they've gotten a diagnosis, and it's ranged between $26,000 and $96,000.
Wow.
And that was in the $96,000 was some years ago. I guarantee those costs would be higher now if this is not recognized. So it's our hope that in the future, if a patient comes to the ER and the doctor there is wondering about this, they may want to do this test and see if there's a susceptibility there, especially if they've previously had tests, CAT scans, MRIs, upper GI, lower GI. These tests are almost always negative. They're expensive. They can be invasive. We're hoping that this is going to lead to better identification and saving people time and money as well as pain.
Yeah, definitely that. Before I move us off the sites, do you have anything that you want to say on any of these sites before I move to the next set?
Oh, I think we're good.
All right. So let's talk about, so far during this set, we have talked about, the 2 primary, folks who are in this dance. The first being high THC, and then second being showing mutations on these sites. And, as somebody who's been in the scene for a long time and have had friends who have experienced these symptoms, and I've seen them firsthand, there's a lot of us who have participated in really ugly threads on social media about what was causing these symptoms, and then eventually being called CHS. 2 of those are neem, which is a crushed up seed used as a fertilizer and to some a pest discouragement. And then other people were making suggestions that it's clearly Eagle 20, a classically banned cannabis pesticide. And the defense of it being 1 or 2 or both of these were just like off the charts. To see people get so angry with each other about bro science is really disheartening. So we've got to address these, Ethan. So what can you tell us about neem, and what can you tell us about pesticides as their ability to be causes for CHS?
Well, they are not. I have been a great critic of pesticide use in cannabis. I've published about this before, and it would have been nice if that were the answer, but it's not. As someone who had the misfortune of treating patients with pesticide exposure, I can tell you that it's a totally different situation to CHS. And as someone who uses organic neem on my fruit and berries, it doesn't fit either. The symptoms do not match up at all, and they certainly are not producing genetic mutations at this level. It is the case that some pesticides could mess with a person's DNA, but I'm afraid that that is just delusional to think that that's the cause of this syndrome. A couple of other examples. Again, this syndrome, CHS, was first described in 2004. At that time, it was not the degree of pesticide usage in cannabis culture that there is today. So that doesn't make sense. Additionally, CHS has been encountered, unfortunately, with synthetic cannabinoids as well, where although they certainly can be toxic, there's no reason to think that there would be pesticides or neem in those. So that's just one of those theories that doesn't hold water.
So, Ethan, the assertion that you made that there were less pesticides being used in 2004 than there are now, like that jumps up to me like a red flag. So I'm curious if you would break that thought out to me, because, as far as most of us chat, most of us say, back in the day, people would put, any kind of evil pesticide on their stuff so that they could get it out through, the black market, and people didn't know their customer as often. And because they were shipping it places, or they were, putting it downstream. Whereas nowadays, people are more aware of the pesticides being unhealthy, and more people are looking for pesticide-free stuff. That's my assumption, right? What's in your head that gives you the idea that they were used more in 2004?
Well, it's based on what I've heard from testing labs. Now, again, the sophistication in identifying these compounds is greater than it was. I think that this is a phenomenon that's gone through peaks and valleys.
Yeah.
So, I couldn't give you the statistics in any given year, but suffice it to say that pesticides and neem are not the cause of cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome.
Right on. That part I get well. All right, great. So, all right. So let's wrap up this set. When we come back in to set 3, we're going to talk about, a handful of questions that don't have, easy categories. But for now, let's go ahead and take our break. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is neurologist and cannabis researcher, Dr. Ethan Russo. While I love growing under the sun, there's a lot of good reasons to grow indoors. And if you're like most folks, you want a lighting source that grows high-yielding, healthy plants without using excessive amounts of electricity. BIOS Lighting creates biological lighting solutions that brings the natural brilliance of the outdoors into your grow room. BIOS Lighting has the attributes that I look for in a horticultural lighting solution. I've bought those cheap lights online, and they're difficult to work with and fail in no time. In contrast, my BIOS LED light is industrial grade to last a long time. It is IP66 wet rated, so little foliar overspray won't harm it. It is easy to clean without taking it down, and of course, the most important aspect, it is built for the exact light spectrum I want for great yielding, healthy cannabis plants. And it doesn't hurt that their lighting rigs look badass too. Many horticultural LED lighting systems are based on irrelevant performance metrics, and people love to argue online about these numbers. I prefer to judge on par photon efficiency and how happy my plants are, and the BIOS lights exceed my expectations in these categories. BIOS lights have an optimized broad spectrum that maximizes photosynthesis and plant growth, while also providing the ideal conditions for superior par efficacy and a comfortable visual experience. I also love their attentive and overeducated customer service folks. BIOS starts with a team of biologists before getting the electrical engineers involved. They have studied how light impacts cannabis plants and devised an overall strategy that works. I encourage you to check out their website at bioslighting.com to learn more about how this strategy can work for you. And Shaping Fire listeners can get a special deal. Use the discount code SHAPINGFIRE, all one word, no caps, for 10% off your entire purchase. That's bioslighting.com. After you've caught up on the latest Shaping Fire episodes, do you sometimes wish there was more cannabis education available to learn? Well, we got you. Shaping Fire has a fabulous YouTube channel with content not found on the podcast. When I attend conventions to speak or moderate panels, I always record them and bring the content home for you to watch. The Shango Los YouTube channel has world-class speakers including Zoe Sigmund's lecture, Understanding Your Endocannabinoid System, Kevin Jodrey of Wonderland Nursery talking about breeding cannabis for the best terpene profile, Frenchie Canoli's Lost Art of the Hashishin presentation, Nicholas Mahmood on regenerative and polyculture cannabis growing, Dr. Sunil Agrawal on the history of cannabis medicine around the world, Eric Vlosky and Josh Rutherford on solventless extraction, and Jeff Lowenfels on the soil food web. There are several presentations from Dr. Ethan Russo on terpenes and the endocannabinoid system too. While there, be sure to check out the 3 10-part Shaping Fire Sessions series, one with Kevin Jodrey, one with Dr. Ethan Russo, and one with Jeff Lowenfels. And even my own presentations on how to approach finding your dream job in cannabis and why we choose cannabis business even though the risks are so high. As of today, there's over 200 videos that you can check out for free. So go to youtube.com/Shango Los or click on the link in the newsletter. As cannabis regulations become more demanding and consumers become more educated, it is increasingly important to avoid the use of chemical pesticides when cultivating cannabis. Beneficial insects have been used for decades by the greenhouse vegetable and ornamental plant industry, and today many cannabis cultivators are moving from sprays and chemicals to beneficial insects. Koppert Biological Systems has the beneficial insects, mites, and nematodes, microbials, sticky cards, and air distribution units you need to partner with nature to defend your garden. Whether you manage acres of canopy or have a simple grow tent in your home, Koppert is ready to help answer your questions and help you transition away from chemical sprays towards clean and natural solutions. Since 1967, Koppert has assisted growers in identifying pests and devising reliable solutions while providing healthy insects and mites that will protect your yield. Since the 1990s, Koppert has been a leader in cannabis pest and disease control worldwide and have highly trained consultants to assist you in Canada and the US from coast to coast. No matter where you live, Koppert Biological Systems can help. Visit Koppert.com, choose your country, and get detailed information. That's Koppert, Koppert.com. For the most up-to-date cannabis-related biological control information, you can also check out their Instagram at Koppert Canada. You know getting away from pesticides is good for health and good for business, and Koppert is ready to help. Visit Koppert.com today. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I'm your host, Shango Los, and our guest this week is neurologist and cannabis researcher, Dr. Ethan Russo. So, Ethan, one of the things that the paper points out that, I really identified with was the paper said that in general, people waited a long time to get help. And while I'm certainly the kind of man who's willing to ask for directions when I'm driving my car, and I'm not afraid to go to the doctors, it all just sounds like, a pain in the ass to have to go. But at the same time, these symptoms are severe, and the sooner you go, the better, your likelihood for treatment is. So can you kind of talk to both the psychological aspect of, people resisting going to a doctor about something, but also more specifically, what you saw as the line in the sand for these patients of when they had enough?
Well, I think it often has required the intervention of a family member or friend, quite frankly. For some of these patients, they'll spend all day in the shower as long as the hot water lasts. It really can come down to that, unfortunately. Plus, there's the factor that some of them have already been told that this is likely related to cannabis usage, and it's not a message that's well received. And then there's the whole factor of legality or illegality. We on the West Coast are more accustomed to cannabis being legal, but that's not true everywhere at all. And there's still a stigma attached, no matter how you look at it.
Yeah, I buy that. And for most of us who use cannabis, even though I consider it all medical, most people think about it either medical or recreational, but the medical care system is not necessarily our friend, either of us. And no one wants to go to the hospital to be, treated like an addict or something,
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's talk about the treatment. So, the paper makes it sound very cut and dry that the only treatment apparently is stopping using cannabis for a while. Is it that cut and dry?
Well, it is if we're talking about eliminating the problem. Yes. Now, that doesn't preclude the idea that we may develop approaches that are going to reduce or mitigate symptoms. But we don't have anything like that now. You can't cover your body in capsaicin cream as a regular treatment. So, at this point, we have signals from our results, places to point for possibilities. We know that haloperidol works better than other antiemetics. There is another drug, aprepitant, has been used in one patient. It works on a different area in the brain. One of the things to wonder about is, could the problem be attacked by something from cannabis other than THC? That's really possible.
Say for example, whenever you take your THC, make sure you take some CBN with it or something like that.
No, I'm afraid that isn't going to work. Seemingly, any exposure to THC is a risk factor for someone who has CHS. Again, there may be a certain threshold, and we find people are trying to skirt that threshold all the time. But when an attack hits, it's too late. Again, there's an extremely high relapse rate with this syndrome once it's established. We have to recommend, or someone in my position as a physician has to recommend, abstinence from THC exposure.
Is it more like a tolerance break, or is it you should stop using THC forever ever, or is it
at all?
At all. So it's not like, oh, you're a daily dabber, you need to go down to joints only, something like that.
Again, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that there is a low level threshold, but people are not going to be able to resume their prior intake levels.
I see.
That's clear.
Yeah, and this is very individualized medicine, so none of these are generalities, really depending on the susceptibility of each person. You use the term attack. You said when they have an attack. I had not really considered it as an attack. So do they come on like an episode where you're not feeling it? Okay, will you describe an episode?
Well, I could start with this prodrome of nausea and vomiting, or low-level nausea, and then progress to a full-blown episode with nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain. And
over the course of a day, or is this like over the course of a week?
It can vary, but often there may be weeks or even months of the prodrome before full-blown attacks.
So we've got the possibility that changes in usage could be helpful. We've got a possibility that some of this pharmaceuticals might be useful, but really the long and the short of it is once you're diagnosed with CHS, what is actually called for is cessation of THC.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now again, there may be other adjunctive approaches that are helpful. We're trying to look at whether lifestyle factors enter in, whether there are dietary changes that could be helpful, anti-inflammatory diets, more healthy diets, fruits and vegetables. That's unclear at this point, but that would be possible. Could aerobic activity or meditation or any of these other things be helpful? We're at a stage where these are avenues that need to be explored, but I wouldn't have any hard and fast suggestions aside from THC avoidance.
Mm-hmm. The study mentions a couple times particular patients that exhibited withdrawal symptoms, and most folks don't consider cannabis addictive, therefore it's not really going to have withdrawal symptoms. And I understand that, like, for a patient who is using THC for, reduction of suffering, the lack of that, causes pain, but that's not really withdrawal. What are these withdrawal symptoms that some of the patients exhibited?
Well, it isn't pink elephants, associated with alcohol addiction. Rather, when people have withdrawal symptoms from cannabis usage, it's usually some combination of mild symptoms: anxiety, insomnia, nervousness. It's usually relatively short-lived. But the fact that people had been labeled as cannabis addicted or admitted to withdrawal symptoms to a higher degree in our population is significant. Mm-hmm. And I guess one might expect it from the high levels of use, but again, the controls, had similar usage rates without the same levels of addiction or withdrawal. So there's clearly a difference here.
Both this study and an earlier study that is quoted within your survey list differences between the genders, both in participation and in people who are experiencing CHS. Are we seeing any, I don't know what you'd call it, but gender predilection for men or women to be more likely to get this?
Yeah, that's always an interesting issue. It's clear from prior studies that there seemed to be a male predominance in CHS, but that's not what we saw. Now, first, let's look at what happened before. It is clearly the case that more men are going to be high volume users of THC. But maybe less and less the case, again, given current demographic trends. In our survey, we had a female predominance in both the CHS patients and the controls. Now, that could be due to the willingness of women to participate in the study. So hard to say. But I think that it's clear that a person of either gender could be susceptible to development of CHS if they have genetic predilection towards it and high rates of use of THC.
All right, that makes sense. So it's interesting too that the older study showed more males, and this newer study shows more females. Because the sample size is pretty small in both studies. Do you think that's more likely just the randomness of who signed up?
It always could be. Yeah, it's certainly possible.
All right, fair enough. Before this survey came out, a lot of people who believed they had CHS were trying to help themselves by using CBD, increasing their cannabidiol. Is there any suggestion that cannabidiol, because of its general ability to modulate THC, is going to be any use for us?
Maybe. The problem is it's not clear-cut from the information that we have at this time. Part of the problem, of course, is that it's hard to get material that is solely CBD with no THC. Labeling isn't always going to give you the answer either. We see a fair amount of THC contamination, if you will, of supposed CBD material. But it is possible that a pure CBD preparation might offer some protection, but that's conjectural at this point, and it also may not be what people really want.
Meaning it won't get them the results that they're looking for?
Exactly.
Yeah, right
why are people using this much cannabis? It may be because there are two reasons. Number one, they enjoy it, and/or it's treating something. They're using it to treat something, some symptom that they have. So could CBD replace that? One hopes, but I wouldn't say there's any guarantee at all. But there could be other cannabis components that are going to be proved to be useful, or adjunctive treatments. But again, that's conjectural at this point, and something we'd like to explore in the future.
Mm-hmm. The five sites that we looked at earlier, are we aware of other actions that happen on those sites that could suggest that there is a different cause to this than THC, or is the correlation so high that other suspects are less likely?
Yeah, it's the latter. THC is the sine qua non. If there isn't THC aboard, you don't see CHS. Right. That part's clear.
So that there might be other things involved, but THC is it's not going to happen.
Yeah, there's this expression, there's no never and no always in medicine, but this is one of those situations where it appears that THC is always associated with CHS.
Right on. Great. Well, I think that wraps us up for today. Ethan, thank you so much for sharing this information. This is, CHS or this host of symptoms has been a boogeyman in our community for so long. And, I remember being down at Emerald Cup, probably 3 or 4 years ago, and we all shared a house. And I remember one of the friends who was staying with us lost her whole weekend because she had an episode, and she spent the entire weekend in the hot bath and a hot shower. And, that was my first time that I had really come across it. And it seemed absolutely, terrible to go through it. But also she was there, as an employee before she was there working, and she wasn't able to do that either. And it's nice that there's finally, I believe this is, if not the first study to pull it all together, at least the biggest study. And it's nice to see this finally coming together to put some light on it. Do you see research on this now continuing? Like, are there already second and third wave studies that have seen what you're doing and are ready to jump on and take the baton?
Well, we're not quite published yet, so no. This study has been accepted for publication in the journal called Cannabis and Cannabinoid Research. We hope that it will spur other efforts. We certainly plan to remain involved in studying this unusual condition. It's our hope this is going to lead to better identification of CHS and hopefully better treatment in the future.
All right, that's great. And so if you're listening, we're not going to publish this episode until the paper comes out. And so there will be a link to the paper on the website. And, in case the idea that Ethan just said the paper's not out and yet you want to read it, this episode will not come out until it actually comes out into the world. So Ethan, thank you so much. Appreciate to have you here as always. Thank you for reaching out and offering us your first interview on the topic. And we wish you much success in fleshing this out more.
Thank you. I welcome the opportunity.
If you want to find out more information about this study or the folks that were involved with it, you can go a couple places. First and foremost, you can go to Ethan Russo's company, Credo Science, which is credo-science.com. You can also go to their partner for this survey, which is endocannhealth.com. That's ENDOCANNA health.com. And if you listened to a couple episodes ago with Dr. Chris Spooner, the naturopath who taught about individualized medicine, he's over at Endocanna Health as well, and he is one of the co-authors with Ethan on this survey. And then, of course, Ethan always shares his email address in case you want to reach out to him directly, and that's Ethan Russo at Comcast.net. And if you do email Ethan, give him some time to get back with you, because he does try to get back with everybody, but he's a busy person doing a lot of traveling for research, so be kind and be patient. You can find more episodes of the Shaping Fire podcast and subscribe to the show at shapingfire.com and wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed the show, we'd really appreciate it if you would leave a positive review of the podcast wherever you download. Your review will help others find the show so they can enjoy it too. On the Shaping Fire website, you can also subscribe to the newsletter for insights into the latest cannabis news, exclusive videos, and giveaways. On the Shaping Fire website, you'll also find transcripts of today's podcast as well. Be sure to follow on Instagram for all original content not found on the podcast. That's at Shaping Fire and at Shango Los on Instagram. Be sure to check out the Shaping Fire YouTube channel for exclusive interviews, farm tours, and cannabis lectures. Does your company want to reach our national audience of cannabis enthusiasts? Email hotspot@shapingfire.com to find out how. Thanks for listening to Shaping Fire. I've been your host, Shango Los.